In terms of the current study design, the current study seeks to elucidate the effect of chaplain visits on AMI patients based on length of stay. Length of stay is a general, fairly gross indication of how well a patient's doing. The reason that's used is the thinking is if a patient's doing better, they have a shorter length of stay at the hospital because the hospital would like to discharge them as soon as possible, and so it's a fairly good indication of how the patient is doing in terms of recovery, and to compare the cost data of the AMI patients. Interestingly, a study I did not mention in this presentation showed that at the end of life, religious patients took more cost and health care because they opted in for more life-saving measures. So to really elucidate out how is cost affected by chaplain visits is another dimension and purpose to this study. The study will collect over 900 retrospective data sets, about 150 that were exposed, and about 768 that were not exposed. These patients were seen at Medical Center of the Rockies in Loveland in the last 2.5 years. MCR has been open only for the last 2.5 years, so it's since the date of accepting patients. Criteria includes a first-time myocardial infarction patient. It's very important that these are to potentially eliminate confounding variables. First-time AMI patients are drastically different from people who have had multiple heart attacks because as one has more and more heart attacks, the mortality rate goes up, the instances of comorbidity goes up drastically, so it's important to sort of say, okay, only first-time AMI patients to elucidate at least a few of the connections. And then also between the ages of 50 and 75, generally the first sign of a heart attack for a patient less than 50 years old is death. And so that's something that we don't want as part of the study. And above 75, as discussed before, there's generally a higher prevalence of comorbid conditions that could potentially be confounding variables to the study, and the patient needed to be seen at MCR. The controlled group did not receive or request chaplain visits, and the test group did in fact receive the chaplain visits. The study methods we will discuss here briefly. In December, we were approved by the Institutional Review Board at the hospital to conduct this study. We will use descriptives as sort of gross indications of differences between the groups, mean, median, mode, and ranges. We will use frequencies to compare the control and the test group as well. Particularly interesting is the ANOVA we will use to evaluate differences between and within the groups. So as one receives more chaplain visits, is there an increase, exponential or linear? Is there an increase in the effects seen as more and more chaplain visits are conferred? We'll use an alpha of 0.05 for p-values, which is generally acceptable as a test for significance. And we expect good power due to the incredibly large size of our study sample. And this is a point I will come back to in a coming slide. So we've talked about chaplains as sort of part of this study, and I don't want to let that go. I want to discuss a little in more detail what are these chaplains and what is it they do. Well, a chaplain must complete a bachelor's degree in graduate training. They must also have 1,600 hours of clinical pastoral education in order to practice in the field. They must demonstrate competency in integrating psychological skills and religious training, and they also must show an involvement with patients that includes recognize religious functions. Now, it's important to note that chaplains do not proselytize. Whatever the patient is or believes in, the chaplain is there to support and takes part in any rituals or sacraments or otherwise to support the patient's belief. Chaplains see on average 20% of hospitalized patients in the United States. We're running at about that average for our study at MCR. I believe the chaplains for this study saw between 15 and 20% of the patients. So we're right on the average there. It's good to note that 86% of patients visited by chaplains said they appreciated the visit. A patient must request chaplain in order for the chaplain to come and give whatever services are necessary. But it's nice to note that those that requested were generally pretty happy with what they got. And specific to chaplains, and this study is actually, of all the studies we've discussed this morning, probably the most relevant and lays the biggest foundation for what we're currently doing. A study showed a reduction in length of stay in COPD patients. Big difference between this study and our study is this was a pilot study with only about 50 so people in it, and ours has over 900. So it comes back to that power. If a strong, significant difference was seen in a relatively few number of patients, we expect to see a very significant difference in our study as a result of having more statistical power. It's also interesting to note that COPD patients are pretty analogous to AMI patients in that both of these diseases keep people in the hospital for about 8 days. So there's a decent analogy to be made about the length of time spent in these patients, and so I think this is a great study to sort of lay the foundation for what we're doing here. We expect to find that chaplain visitation is in fact correlated with a reduced overall length of stay in AMI patients. We expect there to be more effects as more visits are conferred, sort of the more is better, simplicity there, and we expect as a result of a reduced length of stay for there to also be a reduction in the cost. I'd like to acknowledge in particular Dr. Gilkey, the PI for the project, and my thesis advisor, Dr. Keefe, also for being here today. He's our statistician and epidemiologist. I'd also like to thank Don Orwick, the chaplain at MCR, for his incredible work on this and collecting the data, and Bob Casey over there and analyzing it. Of course, I'd like to thank Kim Woods McCormick,